Someone's dog is barking a lot in the background.
Sorry, I'm not ready yet. Let me get a piece of paper.
Okay, I'm ready. Right. Okay, so I can start now, right?
I am now ready. Yes, thank you.
All right. The United States of America has literally the largest military expenditure than the two next countries on the top of the list. But at the same time, they have to use floppy disk technology to access things like nuclear codes or weapon or launching missile codes, for example. We think that this leaves the United States at a back foot that is incredibly disadvantageous. We think that the United States military should be significantly modern, given the fact that it's devoted so many resources over such a long period of time to achieve its foreign policy objectives. What do we prefer the United States military do then? Modernizing would look like, for example, streamlining technology to improve communications, for example. So we would see a move towards a less labor-intensive way of manning manpower bases, for example. It would look like the use of artificial intelligence and machine learning to guard against things like the cyber attacks on manpower bases that are becoming more and more frequent. It looks like getting better stealth technology to help with surveillance and reconnaissance. This looks like things like getting the Defense Research Institutes more money and more grants, and incentivizing technology experts within the private sector to move into this field to help us develop. And we think that there are ways for us to incentivize this sort of behavior by giving things like subsidies and relocation opportunities and subsidies for those experts to move to the Pentagon, for example. We think that these things are entirely possible. That's not the big part of the debate. Three things in argumentation that I want to forward. The first is about how we can strengthen our military bases around the world, where in the US where they are needed. An additional layer of this argument will cover why, even if we are not needed in these cases, why is it important that we give the United States some bandwidth to move away from looking like they're hostile. The second thing that I want to talk about then is about how we better deal with non-state actor level threats. This refers to like cyber attacks by like anarchist groups and things like that, as well as terrorist cells from over the international terrorist cells. The last thing that I want to then get into is about private military contractors that are incredibly super like predatory and why this world under government's world we are likely to protect minorities better. First, why do we strengthen military bases better than the opposition? And I think we need to realize that military presence for the United States is projected through our bases. The objective of these bases is to provide regional security that maintains a balance of US, or not a balance of power, but specifically and more selfishly a US hegemony of influence and power. Because the alternative would be things like Russia or like China, and these are the far less preferable alternatives for power, for hegemonic influence. Therefore, we would suggest to you that modernization gives you exponential effectiveness in terms of kill rate and efficiency. And the reason why is because in the long term, these technologies are, for example, in AI, self-learning, for example, and therefore we think that in terms of firepower, you are going to be likely to see a significant more influence besides just artificial intelligence, self-learning mechanism. We have things like, for example, the fact that when there is innovation or there is competition among states to develop these technologies, that's something that results in greater innovation. We think that there's that exponential effectiveness. The comparative then opening opposition must deal with is that they have to man manpower bases that are incredibly obsolete in a lot of cases and often very defenseless in the case of very new warfare tactics that currently exist in the status quo that are used by non-state actors, for example, when we talk about cyber attacks later, for example. So, therefore, we would suggest to you that dealing with state-level conflict requires better deterrence. And the way we do this under our side of the house is develop things like better aircraft carriers, or develop supersonic flight, for example, so that military pressure can be projected from across the Pacific into Asia. This also means that China can be better checked and balanced under our side of the house, because China in the status quo has become incredibly bold in their pursuit of global hegemonic influence. This looks like them doing the whole being belligerent in the South China Sea conflict. We suggest that under our side of the house, technology is something that we can use to counteract the Chinese Communist Party's influence and ambitions in the status quo. We think that Xi Jinping is more likely to respond to that is more likely to be deterred by that sort of technological advancement, as opposed to just increasing our numbers of ships or aircraft carriers at that particular region. Therefore, what's the second tier of this argument? Look, so even if we are not needed in these places, we have more bandwidth at the very least to move out of these regions and and perhaps like consign troops to a region where it's more needed. The reason why this also is good is because it reduces the kind of criticism that is levied against the United States currently, which is to say that like the United States being physically present in these regions is in itself a form of hostility that can escalate conflict. We would suggest to you that being able to be more stealthy with the way we maintain a presence, or that we are able to look over a region in a less physical or in a less explicit way, would be significantly better in terms of de-escalating conflicts than in the war of the opening opposition, whereby they commit millions of troops across the globe to make sure that they have some sort of overt show of military might. I think that's something that makes leaders like Xi Jinping or like Vladimir Putin significantly more likely to act on their fragile male egos and like escalate the conflict further. We think this is one of the ways for us to make sure that in the cases where we can de-escalate conflict, in the cases where we can move our regions, we are still able to make sure that we protect US foreign policy interests. The second thing I want to get into is about how we deal with non-state actor level threats. Two things. First, I think we deal with anarchist movements that grow within the United States currently, and it reduces the ability for like foreign interference, like the Russians, to collude with these anarchist movements. So what we want to do is neutralize like the threat to domestic security, but also make sure that Russians cannot undermine the US foreign policy objectives of things like making sure they are able to commit to certain regions and make sure they can commit to deterring aggressors in, like, for example, the South China Sea conflict. We think that that's the reason why, under our side, we are better off. But also, the second thing is about the war on terror. We are more likely to win the war on terror and end conflicts, for example, against ISIS, when you can intercept and disrupt their communications from a much greater distance, because there's an element of surprise, because the anticipation is that you're not able to jam their signals from a specific distance. We think that this is something that would be much better off for us. The last thing that I want to get into is about how private military contractors are now significantly disempowered in the world of the opening government. Here's the thing. We think that minorities and people that are of lower socioeconomic status are currently being targeted by the private military contractors like Blackwater because of the fact that they are often jobless. The United States currently has the inability to save things like sunset industries, and they continue a trend of protectionism that actually drives a lot of these people out of work. We think that the continuity of these manpower bases necessarily means that you lock these people who are becoming jobless into a cycle of consigning themselves to a life of being away from their family, and also risking their lives needlessly in the context of a lot of conflicts whereby like they're just not likely to do anything to significantly make the situation better, even by being physically present. It is for that particular need for us to continue mending these manpower bases. We think that the fundamentally opening government wants a world in which we are able to reduce military size, but still be able to achieve and even better obtain the military or the US foreign policy objectives for the United States. For these reasons, we are very proud to propose.
Thank you, PM. Now LO, here.
Testing. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Okay. Panel, OG wanted to be the human house in this debate. They wanted to tell you they put an end to war, they put an end to suffering, they put an end to these individuals who get harmed on a low-level basis. I want them to defend the fact that they're going to end up bombing children in countries far away with no recourse, with no kind of regret, because the media is not going to be invested in those kind of circumstances. A few rebuttals before we get on to the case of opening opposition. It was really unstrategic of him to paint this idea that the US military is being harmed by the use of floppy disks. Let's state one thing clear. The US military, if it is as advanced as you say, I don't buy the characterization that they're so unadvanced that they have communication issues, that they have problems communicating with one another, that they don't have technocrats in the Pentagon. The reality of the situation is the US military has the money to buy all those things. All of these things already happen on our sides. Risk assessments, experts coming in, weighing out of military possibilities. The one difference from them to us is that those military possibilities and that risk becomes much lower for the United States to engage in war the moment by which we're not risking men on the line. I think that this idea of like talking about cybersecurity and hacking, those things we can equally support the prevention of on our side, right? Those things are solved by intelligence agencies anyhow, not like military agencies. You have the FBI, you have the CIA. The final thing is, not the final thing. He talked about US hegemony as a mode of power. First of all, notice the fact that he took a huge burden and now therefore opening government has to prove to you why China should be the most hegemonic in the world. But also notice the fact that all the threats of the hegemony of the United States are no longer fought by military might in the 21st century. They're fought by economic might. That's why you have the trade war. That's why you have control of the South China Sea. All of those things that the United States is doing quite adequately without the fact that they need to military intervene and bomb China. That's not how it works. We think if that would actually lead to a greater war. This idea, and then he talked about ideas of innovation. I don't see why tech companies aren't responsible for most of the innovation in the world anyhow. You got companies like Google and Amazon that always create new tech. I don't think you need to rely on the military. And the final thing he talked about was the idea of stealthy intervention and the de-escalation of things, in the de-escalation of warfare. We think that the use of the United States as the world police pretending they're invincible has only caused harm in society. You ask me Che Guevara, we ask you Kosovo, we ask you Muammar Gaddafi, and we ask you how stable those governments have been when the United States can prove that they are rushed and they can act on their own accord. What are we for on side opening opposition? We are against the idea of trading off more soldiers and unmanned. This does not mean we support war. We think war actually decreases the moment by which they're using men and not advancing into drones. We think they have to defend things like unmanned combat, things like drones, like ballistic missiles, things that can go across the world without needing a single man on the ground. We are also going to support retraining industries that support that whole thing about like people going out of employment and stuff like that. We're fine with that on our side. This debate is not for opposition to defend a world in which things get better, but it is merely to show you that governments can get far worse if they're using this thing. They want to talk about smart missiles. Let's first talk about the fact that you damage the entire idea of American citizens and the right for individuals to live in society. First thing, the United States has nothing to worry about in terms of hegemony. The perception of the United States as a protector of the world is something that is not much of a comparative in this debate because of the fact that media will always pay the United States like that, and because of the foothold that they've already had within society. These 6,000 different air bases in the world that continue to exist, right? Not only that, they are the most economically powerful nation in the world. I think the sanctions alone and the fact that like 50% of the world's countries have like half their trade with the United States, I think those help a lot. The second level is the damage to American citizens by which you improve military. Let's be clear, the spending in military capabilities is a very expensive endeavor. It means you have to invest in military that is based on an industry to kill more individuals, on something that is based to kill priorities based by the most privileged in the American society. We think that money, every single bit that you put into military could be better spent elsewhere. In healthcare, where you make the country more, like, it's generally better to cope with pandemics in the first place, right? Or like education, the reason why the United States has so much of an unemployment problem is because of the fact they don't have that universal university education that overrides their saturated markets. But the third level of this is that I think they avoid the fact that warfare increases in the world by which the United States has more weapons to sell. The United States has no interest in the security of the mass public. They are not the land of the free anymore. We point you to Saudi Arabia and how they fight the Houthis. We point you to Israel and how they fight the Palestinians. Those examples show you that the United States is willing to sell weapons to people who engage in the most inhumane versions of war. We say, on the comparative, when you have to put men on the ground, you get people and families that are outraged by every single one of their deaths. They have more of an incentive to question the state and question the state's involvement in wanting to pushing for welfare. This brings me to my second point about end of humane intervention. The troops on the ground have a lot of different check and balances. The United States military is not some sham hawk, right? You got like tribunals that can check into human rights abuses. You have like adverse different amounts of mental psychology help in like a post-World War II, post-Vietnam War world. This means you have a world which is far more careful in how it handles its veterans because they know they have a large voice and they can crumble the amount of funding that they get. First thing, if individuals modernize warfare, you have absolutely no ability for recourse. We point you to the drones in Iran and the millions of children who were killed without ever knowing their names. The difference is, I think the guilt that the soldiers feel means that you ultimately do get a certain level of people that want to report themselves in or report other individuals in the military in. We say that all of this dissemination of information will never happen on their side. But the second thing is, there's no incentive to hold back on any kind of warfare anymore. If the media is if the military is risk averse, there is no longer any risk. There is no longer any chance of your administration being voted out of an election because you didn't kill anybody, you killed another country's people. We think those are the things that outside government has to defend.
Point.
These things have no levels of check and balances. It's past 6, by the way. If there is no human being on the ground, hegemonic media has no incentive to investigate those things. We point you to the examples of how all conflicts in the Middle East are almost never reported when they're hit by a drone. But if there is a human being, an American soldier that died on foreign soil, that intervention is going down. That intervention is being put to an end. Ultimately, ladies and gentlemen, we told you how the advancement of war is criminal, and we are for the decline of the American intervention. All points from this point on from opposition are derivative of this concept. Thank you. Proud to oppose.
Thank you, LO. Now let's hear from DPM. Here. DPM, are you there?
Yep.
All right.
The great thing about a recorded debate is that you can actually play it back and listen to what Joel actually said. We're not bombing fucking children, nor are we choosing intervention as a default option. And it's a fucking long stretch to suggest that keeping military bases open somehow manages to reduce the number of interventions that the United States does. I suggest you that there are better checks and balances. I'll prove that later on. But this debate is not just about what the United States does in isolation. It's about what other countries are doing in response to the United States as well. And at a point of time where China and other nations are developing like technology that can easily destroy these bases with a snap of a button, I suggest to you that the US military presence or the US military troops or forces are going to be far weakened in the long run. The problem with the US military is that it's like the large Labrador dog I wish I owned, right? It looks very big and very threatening, and countries think that it's very big and very threatening, but in reality, it doesn't bite, and it's also incredibly ancient. In the case of the US military and the places where US presence is needed, maintaining 800 bases that reflect the military capabilities of the 1980s makes no sense. And instead of trying in vain to maintain these facilities, which will only get more and more exponentially expensive and more useless as time goes on, the US military needs to move forward with understanding its role as an international actor and rebuilding its military to suit that role. So let's first establish why these bases are currently inadequate and, in fact, like diminishes the US's ability to act as a check and balance to other nations in the region. The first thing you must understand is that these bases were created in the Cold War, right? So they are massive bases that were created because globalization back then was slow. So you need to put physical presence on the ground in order to prevent, for instance, communist expansion in particular areas. But now the world is a lot smaller and this context is no longer as important. So bases are not quite as important in maintaining global hegemony, which is why, like, as OO correctly mentions, economic presence also matters as well. And like if nations like North Korea have the ICBMs that can attack bases in America elsewhere, then I suggest that having a base is not quite as important. This debate calls for us to reduce the number of bases that America controls in order to better improve America's military force. We think that outside does this a lot better. They talk to us about the media and they talk to us about how, well, if there are boots on the ground, then somehow or rather, you know, like war cannot advance anymore. There are plenty of other ways that we can ensure that we don't engage in unnecessary wars. First of all, you still do need to put boots on the ground at a particular stage as peacekeeping efforts as well, right? So you still have the risk of that one American citizen dying, which their side claims seems to be so terrible that that it will reduce like any unsavory interventions to begin with. So I don't see what the unique benefit of their side actually is. But here's the problem with their understanding of this debate. I suggest to you that while it is true that economic might is important, and we do agree that we need to downsize our military or the US military in order to spend more money on economic development to beat other nations in that race as well and to maintain that check and balance, the problem is that maintaining 800 bases throughout the world is antithetical to that particular message, given that it is incredibly difficult to maintain all these bases that are built for the wartime of that generation, and therefore need to be updated in a clumsy and often very expensive fashion to keep up with modern technology. The example of floppy disk wasn't just an isolated example. It is the trend when it comes to the kinds of technology that America is currently using, because they're still relying on Cold War level technology in order to keep those bases there, in order to save costs, because these costs are exponentially great. Before I move on, yes, go ahead quickly.
The reason the United States military became more isolationist is not because of its military might, it's because of the political incentive that was about after the Iraq War. Why would intervention suddenly increase if the perception politically of war is the same?
Okay, so if intervention does not increase, it does not increase either way. Because the fact is that if there is political incentive to not go to bad interventions, then nations will not engage in bad interventions. The question here is, how does the US actually act as an effective check and balance against nations like China? It will not act as an effective check and balance if one Chinese supersonic missile can destroy a US base in Guam with no retaliation whatsoever, because that missile was not built for the technology of the 21st century. So ultimately, what you actually do is you give other nations a lot of an edge. But here is where OO refuses to deal with the ideas that we talked about in OG, right? He said that what actually happens when you put all these military bases in places where they are not actually needed is that you actually exacerbate the paranoia of idiot dictators, right? So it's not about China, because China knows that the US military is pretty fucked, and that's why it's developing these supersonic missiles right now in order to be able to counteract the US in the future. And that is why we need to move forward with our technology in order to make sure that this doesn't happen, and we don't give China a military hegemony over the world. But what is incredibly important as well, and this was untouched by the other side, is that you put a base next to, for instance, North Korea or other dictators, that's where they get paranoid, right? And these bases are useless, but it creates a sort of paranoia amongst the dictator and the population there that the US is at their doorstep, ready to attack. And that is what creates a sort of military aggression that happens throughout the world. No, it happens throughout the world in response to the fact that there is a clear physical US military presence there. Taking that physical presence away and moving towards, right, spending money more efficiently on these missiles that can still reach the same range but do not have the same physical jarring presence that causes these dictators to act, I suggest it's a good thing. I wasn't keeping track of time, so like if somebody can help me with that, that'd be great. Okay, so finally, I also think that that side didn't deal at all, right, with the idea of PMC. So the reason why this is incredibly important is because if you do accept that you need people to run these bases, and the fact that is you can't get enough US volunteers to join the military today, you hire PMCs. And that's where the whole slew of problems with the ethical nature of PMCs happen. When PMCs contracts are hired to exploit individual American citizens to guard these camps and bases, because you have more bases on the ground than you have manpower to maintain these bases. And I suggest to you that that is what eventually, that is what we solve on our side at the point of time where we ensure that these bases, these unnecessary bases are shut down and redirected instead to military technology. So I don't think a lot of the argumentation makes sense. Finally, if they want to talk about downsizing the military for economic progress, I suggest to you that the best way to downsize is to not put so much infrastructure on the ground, because it's much easier to develop R&D into missiles and missile silos in your own nation where there's no like lag that's required to build infrastructure elsewhere in other countries, than it is to develop technology within your own borders itself. You reduce the sort of lag time and cost needed to transport things to so many other places around the world. So if you want to talk about reducing military spending in order to boost the economy, our side does it far better than your side does. I haven't kept track of time, so I think I'm done. So OG.
Thank you, DPM. Now let's hear from DLO. Here.
Chair, we think it's absurd that the side of government aims to somehow decrease the military spending and decrease military might in and of itself. But the way in which they want to achieve this goal is by somehow modernizing technology and making the barrier of entry to any kind of warfare or any kind of like intervention far less. We think that for the US to we think that the fact that you modernize your military, this means that the US finds it far easier to every time you get antagonized, to constantly fund things like interventions in other countries, to constantly fund things like warfare, for example, because number one, the cost towards the country is less, the human cost towards the country is less, but secondly, it's far easier to compete with other global superpowers. We think that this is a harm in and of itself, simply because we on the side of opposition prioritize the demilitarization in the future and prioritize things like economic sustainability, because recognize in the 21st century, it isn't always about winning like military warfare, because all those things are outdated and aren't relevant anymore. But things like economic power are far more relevant, because the warfare of the 21st century aren't military warfare anymore. It's things like economic warfare, and that's why the US has to focus on that in and of itself. We think the fact that modernizing military isn't a sustainable step, because it only increases the funding towards the military, which we highly regret. Moving on to my rebuttals. The first thing they say is that the benefit of modernization is that apparently national security is higher, because you can things like hacking, cyber security is it's far harder for those things to happen. We tell you that we've already have things like the FBI or like secret agencies or private agencies which we can still fund to like only focus on things like national security, hacking, cyber security, etc. Those things don't have to do with the military. They need to tell us, and they have a burden to tell us why the military needs to be involved in those actions. But the second thing they say is that it's easier to counteract the power of China and Russia, because apparently those countries will become too powerful. Recognize the point at which the United States modernizes warfare, it creates a never-ending cycle, because China and Russia will continuously modernize their warfare as well. We think that being able to compete with those countries means that it's a never-ending cycle and competition always grows. The counter narrative that we support is that the point at which we just also recognize that China isn't going to bomb the US or like attack the US any day, because number one, it has like a lot of harm towards its country in and of itself, and given the fact that China wants to prioritize its role as a global superpower and an economic superpower, all those things are antithetical to that goal. Recognize that all those things means that it's not important for the US to increase military spending or modernize their military, simply because a lot of countries like China and Russia aren't going to attack them militarily anyways, because the goal has shifted towards things like economic power and sustainability. The third thing they say is that there's plenty of ways to prevent wars. Things like, for example, building bases within your own country. Recognize that the point at which you modernize your military, this number one means that the point at which there's less human cost means that all the nationalistic sentiments that Americans have that currently counter the anger of politicians and like the will for them to continuously fund warfare are now depleted, simply because there's no human cost anyways. We think that all these things means that all the current checks and balances towards the prevention of warfare fail, simply because people don't really care about like the human cost or the human lives that are lost in other countries, as long as like their own military is safe. The fourth thing they say is that there's things like consignment which they are worried about, simply because individuals will be forced into things like consignment, and this is apparently inhumane. Recognize that all these things are far worse. The point at which you have things like drones, for example, or missiles which constantly bomb individuals in like other countries who don't have any consent towards the harm faced by them. We think that the point at which soldiers have already to some level consented to consignment, consented to the harms they face, or like are aware that they're going into consignment and have some gratification from the people as a return, is already some level of justification why consignment is legitimate, as opposed to every other human civilian who will be actively harmed even more. The point at which you have far more military interventions. Because recognize all those harms are ones that you have no check and balance to, because the information that you're able to achieve from, like, for example, in tribunals where soldiers act as a check and balance when they come out and give information, all those are depleted simply because there's no check and balance to things like drones or missiles, for example. Their power is extremely large and there's no way to counteract or like forming check and balance against it. We think these are extremely harmful because a lot of innocent civilians will be killed. First extension, why this means that there's far less importance for things like diplomatic immunity, diplomatic ties, or diplomatic talks within society. Because recognize the incentive for the United States to be diplomatic will never exist insofar as they know that they have a large modernized military which can constantly fight wars. And like, given things like Trump is going to be in power for a longer time, we think it's far easier for him to use his fragile male ego to fund things like bombing other countries or bombing the national sites, given he's already given this threats. We think that modernizing only makes this problem far worse because you have a lot less human cost to it. And also we think that people on the ground are far likely to support this simply because there's no cost to their soldiers who they are nationalistic about. Because recognize that the importance of diplomacy is only insofar as there's something to lose for the country. The point at which the country knows that they can fight a lot of wars and diplomacy isn't needed anymore, we think that they're less likely to be diplomatic about things like even fighting terrorism, for example. Recognize the problem of terrorism only gets worse, the point at which we keep bombing terrorists and not wanting to negotiate with them, for example. It means that the cycle is continuously perpetuating and the Americans only care about their ego, which means that a lot of warfare will be continuously funded. We think that this is a harm in and of itself, and which a harm that they never stop. We also think that it's far better for them to use things like negotiations and diplomacy in the future because it's far more sustainable for the world. The human cost is less, and all these can happen only if America knows that their military might is one that's archaic and one that cannot sustain for long and slowly demilitarize. Modernization of the military is antithetical to that. We're proud to oppose.
Thank you, DLO. Now let's hear from MG. Here.
Many apologies. I have many papers on a small desk. Three sets of extensions today: framing, weighing, rebuttal will be integrated throughout. Let's get into it. First main extension we're going to be talking about is about why it's so very important that the US and a non-state actor or a rogue state, or separately, China or Russia are the first to develop these technologies. What am I talking about? I think that opening house is losing this debate because they suffer from a lack of imagination. That is to say, they have basically just been talking about things such as supersonic missiles and talking about like cyber technology without recognizing that much of the development is things such as bioweapons, is things such as cybersecurity that has not only the effect to influence elections, but moreover the ability to hold entire nuclear systems, economies at hostage. I think that these are technologies that have the potential to end the world many times over in the hands of actors who are willing to use it without any particular state to stop them. I think that it's the most important impact in the round, i.e. the freaking apocalypse. Okay, three mechanisms under this. The first reason why it's so important for the US to be the first actor to develop this is because there needs to be one particular state who is able to do things such as have defensive mechanisms and countermeasures in order to halt the possibility of an attack from rogue actor or a non-state organization. That is more likely than you think, quite simply because I think that there's a possibility that they can lose control of things, bioweapons are difficult to control, so on and so forth. I think that's where the US has this as opposed to China or Russia, because the US is a uniquely good actor. Not because they're altruistic, but because they're democracy, and they have to be held accountable to their populace. On the point at which you let like 85% of the world's population die, your population is likely to be quite miffed at you, therefore have incentive to share technology. Okay, second argument is that a second reason why it's important is because of deterrence. That is to say, like, I think that, like, even without the possibility of the US defending itself and retaliating after the dust settles, I think that like non-state actors and rogue states do not develop this dangerous bioweapons or other potential like dangerous weapons at the point at which they perceive it as futile, or they perceive it as the US will retaliate if I do this, because they perceive there being a significant gap between the US and between themselves. So at the point at which it becomes quite clear that the US is transitioning from being primarily obsessed with like maintaining its status quo as a world hegemon, having bases everywhere, to putting more and more money into investing in technology, trying these technologies. I think that there's a significant deterrence from discouraging these actors from investing in these technologies in the first place. But the third reason is because I think that at the point at which the US is an actor to develop these weapons is the point at which you're far more likely to have conventions about this. For example, the conventions which are created as to govern like rules to do with nuclear proliferation treaties, so on and so forth. I think that like a good parallel for this is lethal autonomous weapons. That is to say, lethal autonomous weapons is technology that's very close on the horizon. We need to have rules that govern things such as who can produce it, what technology that are allowed to be be imbued within it, and things like protocols with dealing with malfunction, for example. I think that if a rogue state or China is the first one to develop these lethal autonomous weapons, then you have on these conventions, it's utter chaos, far more likely to descend into open war and possibility of like further escalation to a nuclear situation. So for these reasons, I think that if the US does not transition away from this defunct mode of relying on bases onto keeping up with the trends of non-state actors, China, Russia, then the world is basically pretty much over. Impacts of this seem clear: the death of not millions but billions of people. Okay, so second argument is about second extension is about how we break the nuclear deadlock, right? So I think that what I'm talking about is things such as Iran, North Korea, actively choosing to develop nuclear programs, and having other rogue states across the world have active incentive to develop more and more of these, as they saw the Libya example, Gaddafi giving up his nukes and getting fucked, Iran and North Korea developing nukes, getting protection because other states were afraid to approach them. I think there are a few more reasons why it's important for us to break the nuclear deadlock. First of all, because I think that there are just loads of because like even if these rogues, like one is this, these rogue states use these military weapons because they're run by dictators who care about revenge, pride, more than they care about the well-being of their people. But secondly, also because accidents are quite likely in these states with less developed infrastructure. But thirdly, because there are like just hundreds of nuclear warheads drifting around after the downfall of the Soviet Union, which means that terrorists could easily get their hands upon it. We think that the US investing more and more into improving technology like THAAD is really, really important because for a few reasons. One, it is possible now to confront states such as Iran and North Korea, actually, because we have taken away their leverage of nuking South Korea, nuking America, if we try to intervene with them. This is important because we prevent the possibility that they use these nukes in the long term, and also because we're able to liberate millions of people from crushing authoritarian regimes, deaths every day, starvation, so on and so forth. I think that mutually assured destruction continues to exist between China, Russia, and the US because they have a myriad of other ways to significantly damage each other, and because they're already so deeply interconnected economically. So therefore, I think that the goal of trying to of preventing rogue states and preventing the possibility of nuclear destruction is really, really important. Okay, final extension today is about breaking the deadlock between OG and OO. So even though Joel had like 3 mini arguments, 20 seconds apiece at the end of his speech, OG and OO were just primarily concerned about talking about the interactions between US and China. So I'm gonna just break this deadlock because neither of them really did a good job of characterizing this by doing that for you. What is the US and why is it a better actor? One, I just think it's a total lie that states that the US has been killing millions of Iranian and Pakistani children. One fact is that only 300-something civilians died in the aftermath of the Libyan civil war as a result of US and UN drone strikes, but for the simple reason that with the development of more and more modern technology, we have been able to do things such as make strikes more surgical and limit collateral damage. Therefore, the US is a better actor to have a military advantage. But I also think that the US is a good actor for three other reasons. First of all, it's a democracy, therefore it has to be accountable to its people. Two, it has an incentive to maintain the status quo, therefore it's unlikely to take dangerous risks that put many lives at risk. And thirdly, because culturally has a comparatively more of an obsession with privacy and liberty with other states. Why is this important? Because I think that these are all good reasons for us for the U.S. to have a military advantage. And I also think that it's another reason why it's good for us to have no military bases. Because the point at which fewer U.S. troops die, we think this actually has a rate of more humanitarian intervention. We think that this is not the days of us. I think that we don't want to repeat another Rwanda. We don't want to repeat of another Somalia. It's important that the U.S. feels like it has the ability to intervene where necessary to prevent lives, thousands of millions of lives being lost. I think from the biggest impact in this round, vote Team CG.
Thank you, MG. Now for MO, here.
All right, can you hear me? Yeah. Madam Chair, if you listen to the analysis coming from all of side of government, you will realize that their conclusions are mismatched. Because they wanted to say that the US was an inherently good actor, that they were the ones who upheld liberal values, human rights, and did not allow people to go to the predatory deals that China and Russia would put upon them. But what they would do, the solution to this, was to pull out all their troops and instead invest in modernization, when the very reason for the existence of those troops to begin with was never about military might. It was always about soft power. That was what it was always about. I do not think that the contention in today's debate is about who has a larger or better army, because at the point at which they already concede and mutually assured destruction exists, I do not know how a better weapon or a lethal autonomous weapon is somehow going to make you the better actor in today's debate. If you really wanted the ability for US to control these countries, if you really wanted them to be able to impose liberal values upon others, I say you would keep the soft power that the 800 military bases around the world is currently able to attain. That's why they had a systematic inconsistency within their case. Few pieces of clarification. Number one, neither world is good, yeah? We accept that. It's either coercion by the United States on the one hand, or it's China and Russia who's going to be the antagonistic actor. But it's about which is preferable. We agree. I think that opening government and closing government already offered a pretty sensible characterization that the US is probably the better actor. We say you only get that under our side of the house. We'll engage. Few things to note. Number one, opening government gave a really confusing case because they said that the purpose of these bases was to cement hegemony, and that was a good thing. But then they wanted to say, now, look, right? Like, I think it's important to note within the wording of the motion, this house prefers the US modernizing its military at the cost of reducing its military size. They necessarily have to take that trade-off of not having those bases to begin with. The modernization of military necessarily means that US loses its ability to have soft power over these countries, because the presence of these military bases in and of itself is able to exert that sort of influence that they wanted. The second thing they wanted to talk about, so opening and closing said the same thing about how now they're able to combat terrorism faster and things because they have better weapons. I will show you why exactly the lethal autonomous weapons that CG wanted to talk about is necessarily harmful, as it leads to a loss of accountability in warfare and more individuals die on the ground. They also said some confusing thing like US must be the first actor to get to this. I don't think that's part of the debate because China and Russia already have the advantage. They are already having the modernization of the military. So I do not know what that's about. But two arguments, two extensions, yeah? The first is about this, how this guarantees a reliable check and balance to the antagonism of China and Russia, where you only get that under our side of the house. And the second is on how the modernization of the military leads to a lack of accountability of warfare, they proliferate tensions. On the first, right? The premise about why this is a reliable check and balance. The military that is stationed all around the world in places like Djibouti, in areas like Kenya, was never to act as the antagonistic force to impose your military might. They never claimed that they had the best military, but the presence of the military in and of itself and the purpose of it was to exert soft power, because the very physical presence of those troops means that you're able to dictate how they run their country, right? We think that that's why we are the ones who, they literally proved our premise. If the US is a good actor, we get that soft power. The reason why China and Russia is able in the status quo to currently modernize their military instead of doing the same tactics as the US is a couple reasons. It's for factors like their location, which means that their geographical proximity to Asia and to Europe means that they can exert their influence through other things such as the Belt and Road Initiative. So instead of using military necessarily, they can use economic might to impose that. The United States cannot do this because, for example, the location in which they're stationed is far worse. But secondly, it's also the type of economy, right? So China is able to exert a lot of its influence because of its manufacturing capacity over these countries. The US is not able to do that. We give you examples like the string of pearls. This is only a bit able to happen for an actor like China. The seizing of ports. All these happen because China is able to exert that power. I think the US recognizes this, right? Because how does the US exert its soft power? Through military bases all around the world. How do they get NATO to work? NATO literally has an army, which is why they use the army as a way to exert their soft power. Having considered this, I think it's extremely important to note that China and Russia, at the point at which they pull out the troops from these military bases, fill in this vacuum. There are three harms to this. Number one, China and Russia often have predatory loans and a lack of regard for sovereignty. This looks like them seizing ports, right? Like through the Belt and Road Initiative. Secondly, it's about the lack of consideration for human rights. So if you were to get a loan from a Western state or from the IMF, for example, you need to fulfill certain criteria in order to be able to ascertain those benefits. Third, it's a lack of consideration for things like corruption. So Xi Jinping can continue to prop up leaders who are not necessarily beneficial for these countries, right? The US would not do that, and the ability for them to have a military means that they're better, right? They may be forceful and coercive, but both actors would be. It's better on our side because they prevent them from accepting other predatory loans or deals from China and Russia. It also means that China is less actively able to intervene in support rogue activities. So notice China and Russia are currently doing extremely egregious actions militarily in these states. So Syria, right, where they are currently propping up Assad. If you did not have military bases in the Middle East to act as a check and balance, you lose the ability for these rebels to fight against Assad, who is necessarily harmful and literally killing children on the ground. It looks like what they're doing in Iran. All this means that we need a subscription to democratic values and the ability to for the US to check and balance. Sorry, it's past 6. Secondly, the modernization of the military leads to a lack of accountability. Already talked about this, I'll expand on it. Number one, we believe that the occurrence of wars in and of themselves increase. There are currently pre-existing tensions between countries, but wars do not occur because number one, there's a consideration for human lives. Number two, there's public outcry. Necessarily, note the nuance, on their side of the house, modernization decreases the human cost of war, especially in the lethal autonomous weapons that Closing wanted to talk about, because now people are able to actively lobby for governments to fight wars because there's less of a political blowback. My brothers and sisters are no longer dying. I less have a consideration for what's happening on the ground. The outcomes of this is twofold. Number one, casualties increase. Opening talked about that. But number two, right? Because understand the importance of this argument. Even if we think that they are more strategic and they can fire targets more easily, you have massive infrastructure and economic damage that is often permanent and irreversible, right? In its So secondly, right, and note, right, also that the efficiency of these weapons trumps ethics in war, and that's what they have to justify under their side of the house. For all these reasons, I think that they proved the premises that we wanted to have to begin with. The US was a better actor than China and Russia. We get that when we're able to exert soft power on the ground through military bases, but more importantly, they proliferate warfare and exacerbate tensions we're very proud to oppose.
Thank you, MO. Yes, GovWhip, here.
So can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. opposition bench's cases have rested on two simple premises that they never proved. Number one, that war happens too much in the status quo, and number two, that countries stay in conflict for far too long. We said the exact opposite occurs in the status quo, that war happens too little, and that countries actually pull out far too early, and that we're happy to guarantee more interventions because those interventions are likely to be good on our side of the house. I have two questions in my debate, in my speech. Number one, on intervention, and number two, on which side conflict is more ethical. So firstly, let's talk about on which side we get better intervention, right? OO says that when you have boots on the ground and you risk lives, that the US becomes far more war wary. We said two things. Number one, that drones already exist in the status quo, but I think that are more likely to be used on your side when you have troops and bases stationed in specific hotspots, right? Because they're going to be far more likely to be trigger happy when it's a question of their individual self-defense. But the second and more important thing to note right now is that right now, the US is far too reluctant to enter war. And this is bad because politicians care too much about the lives of their own citizens. They care too little about the lives of other individuals around the world and people in other foreign countries. We say what this generally means then is that there's actually a problem where we don't actually engage in war enough. But the thing is, the vast majority of current conflict around the world is good war. It is war against terrorist organizations. It is war that is designed to stop modern conflicts like humanitarian rights violations in places like Rwanda or in places like Myanmar. They're good wars against dictators who are abusing their citizens. All of these are conflicts that we would support, that would help liberate citizens, and despite the casualties, would lead to better lives for many individuals and places. Look, for example, at places like Syria, where I would think most people live better lives in the absence of Assad. But the problem is, the body-backed effect that OP identifies is what incites hasty pullouts and expedient measures to end war. So not only do you not enter war very much on their side of the house, but as soon as individuals enter war and body-back start flooding home to places like the US, the country immediately has to make a 180 and pull out as fast as possible. And this is especially bad because the types of measures they do to pull out means two things. Number one, when they pull out too early, it leads to regional instability in places like the Middle East. For example, when the US pulled out of Afghanistan far too early before they were able to actually guarantee stability, it led to the rise of ISIS. Number two, when the US pulls out, they often use dirty measures to try to end war and make it as bloody as fast as possible to force the other side to surrender. What that does is things like carpet bombing, which is precisely what leads to more casualties compared to on their side of the house. When we reduce the human cost to war, it means people can more strategically calculate the effects of it and when exactly to enter, and that means it's far better for individuals. What were the responses we heard? The only response we basically heard was that there are no tribunals or checks for drones. There were two responses to this, right? The first one is that drones and surgical strikes are very precise in the status quo, right? They're specifically aimed at targeting enemies or assassinating targets that are deemed as bad. But number two, there was a strong incentive for the US not to destroy and kill civilians for two reasons. Number one, when they kill civilians, then they are forced to often pull out of countries wholesale because the country doesn't want them in there anymore, CF Iraq. Number two, they catch a lot of international flack for killing civilians and killing innocent people, which obviously is bad for their own reputation and bad in the world on the global stage, which means there's a natural incentive not to just kill random children, right? So this already falls out of debate in the vast majority of cases. I don't think it's enough for them to say this. But the second crucial analysis we gave you was that the capacity to intervene in countries that are currently in a nuclear deadlock with the US increases, which means the US has a greater capacity to influence places like North Korea, when North Korea can no longer credibly use the threat of nuclear attacks against South Korea when they've implemented defense systems like that that are very, very strong and very, very important. What is the impact of this and why do we outweigh OG? We beat out OG because the threshold that we identify that's important in the US being able to enter conflicts and end them effectively is not military strength, rather the willingness to engage in conflict in the very first place. We are the team that targets that specific threshold that's preventing better war on our side, and that's why we beat out OG. Secondly then, what did CO say? CO says that bases are actually very important for military projection and soft power. I would just like to note two things. Number one, that your ability to project soft power is dependent on the credible threat of being able to use your weapons. But the problem is there is no credible threat because of OO's own analysis, right? Because people know you're not willing to enter war because everyone's war fatigued, you don't want to risk boots on the ground. Number two, that soft power just simply isn't as important as what we're talking about, which is actually entering wars and saving massive numbers of lives on our side of the house. That's far more important than any soft projection that you're able to have on your side. But thirdly, that even if we compare your side and said that your side were able to save lives, that we save far more because conflict is no longer physical, that having physical bases is actually a significant diminishing return to the ability for you to conduct effective warfare, because conventional warfare no longer works because the types of enemies we're going up against are not other states anymore. There's states like terrorist organizations that are often able to elude regular conventional warfare with things like aircraft carriers, right? Which is why they don't work in the vast majority of cases, and you need to pivot towards using cybersecurity, using drone strikes and things like that instead. Final clash then, on which side war is more ethical. Before I move on, happy to take a POI from opening.
The rise of ISIS and other terrorist organizations are due to the fact that American intervention caused them to have enough propaganda to play the victim card. Explain to us exactly how you prevent that from happening in further interventions and prevent the cycle of war happening in countries like Syria and Iraq.
One, that is already the status quo where they have ammunition against the West. They will always have ammunition against the West because it's their doctrine. Number two, I would contend that the rise of ISIS was not due to the US intervening, but the fact that the US pulled out far too early. They left a massive power vacuum that allowed for a rogue state to emerge. So on which side is war more ethical? We told you it was imperative for the US to develop this cutting edge technology first, for two reasons. Number one, because they can better impede the development of these technologies by other states once they're able to possess them firsthand. So for example, once the US possessed nuclear weapons, they were better equipped to actually prevent Iran from developing nuclear weapons by sabotaging their centrifuges and other things like that. Number two, when the US possesses these weapons, they were able to create conventions to govern the use of these weapons ethically or either ban them outright, which cannot happen when the US has no knowledge about the existence of these weapons. What do they say in response? Their only response is China and Russia already have these weapons, which is wrong for three reasons. Number one, that they're just militarily less developed than the US. Number two, because they have weaker economies and therefore have less to spend on the military, right? Like Russia's economy is the size of Italy. It's obviously not competing against the US in terms of the speed of development. Number three, the US spends far more money on development. See at the first 10 seconds of PM's speech, because they spend much more, they get far better returns, right? What did OO say in response to this? OO says that when the U.S. moderates, when the U.S. Develops their weapons, that China and Russia do as well. But the problem is when the U.S. does nothing, China and Russia still modernize. They still develop their weapons, which means that the harms are symmetric, but the benefits are asymmetric. Number two, they say there's less media reporting in OO. The problem is this is untrue because media reporting doesn't just happen in places where there's U.S. base. Media reporting happens all the time because there's obviously a natural incentive for any media organization to cover important breaking news on conflicts around the world. So this is just deeply unclear. So for all of these reasons, because we get more intervention, we get better intervention, and we get more ethical warfare because the US is a comparatively better actor. For these reasons, we're very proud to propose.
Thank you, GovWhip. Now for the last speaker, Upwhip. Here.
The entirety of the government bench explains to us that because China and Russia are modernizing its weapons and because of the danger that they pose, US has to step up and balance that power. We disagree. We tell you that one, US is already enough of a check and balance, but even if it isn't, the fact modernizing isn't going to help them be a check and balance. It's only going to worsen war conditions. It's going to make war less ethical, and it's going to intensify the tensions between China and Russia and going to make the world a more dangerous place. Before I move on to my issues, few levels of rebuttals to both OG and CG, right? So first, let's deal with OG. First, they say that physical troops can't be a check and balance against China. But in the same breath, they also say that physical presence in and around countries are aggressive and like hostile. So if it's true that the presence of troops, especially as large as the US military, is like hostile and has a presence that is intimidating, then it must be a deterrence and must be a check and balance towards other countries like who have hostile intentions. We tell you this doesn't make sense, right? But let's deal with CG. First thing they say is they break the nuclear depth law. Two responses. Firstly, that the reason it exists in the first place is because of modern militarization. This means that if US wants to continue and intensify modern militarization, you're only going to intensify the nuclear deadlock and increase the tensions. But secondly, you can't break the nuclear deadlock because no matter how much you as the US, you modernize your military and build how many nukes, the threat of mutually assured destruction is one which will eventually result in. What is the conclusion? It means that no matter how strong your army is, one, you cannot control China and Russia, because I think it's fair, as the motion states, that China and Russia have already started modernizing, which means they have a large head start compared to US. This means that you can't control China and Russia in terms of modern military and nukes and all that. But secondly, you are already, like, even if you can't control them, you are an existing check and balance because you already have nukes and you already to some extent modernized enough. You already bring the threat of mutually assured destruction to the table. Secondly, we heard that there was too little war in the world. Firstly, we question the premise of altruistic war, right? Even if the actor we're talking about is US, most of the war that US brings is for selfish or political purposes. This means, like, this, for example, looks like proxy wars in the Middle East for oil, and this also looks like the conflict between Israel and Palestine. But secondly, even if it is altruistic, we tell you that the level of casualties and the barrier to entering war is going to be much lower, and the casualties the civilian casualties are going to be much higher. I'll explain why that's so harmful later on. Before I move on, yeah, Oji.
Unmute yourself, Joel.
I can't hear you.
Our case says, here's how we should strengthen bases where we need them, and in the cases where we can pull out, let's pull out for more bandwidth. So that op bench has been misrepping us. Also, how would situating bases near paranoid dictators do anything to de-escalate the conflicts in those regions?
Okay, so if it's true that you want to modernize as much as you want, like you want to compete with the level of China and Russia, it means you have to drastically pull out troops out of so many bases. You have to evacuate all of them. So if you're talking about moving some troops and evacuating some bases, we call that out as a soft case, right? But we tell you it's important and imperative that you have like bases around the world, and I'll prove that later, right? Firstly, so what does it look like in opposition's war? Firstly, we told you about the lack of accountability during war. So OO mentioned this, but we nuanced it more, right? For two reasons. Firstly, it's because you decrease the human cost of war. Because the fact that human lives are reduced in involving war, there's more political pressure to start war, or at least to start war. And B, the difference is existing tensions are escalated. This means there's going to be irreversible destruction of infrastructure and the economy. And two, the number of civilian casualties are going to increase so much. The reason as to why this is true is because compared to human soldiers that have like a guilt and a conscience, these weapons are going to be used without much constraint and without much restriction, which this means that the number of civilian casualties are going to increase. Second harm in opposition's war, the power vacuum once US vacates all the bases. First harm, these bases are going to be lost to like harmful actors such as China and Russia. I think through the entire debate, we proved to you, everybody has proved why China and Russia are much worse actors. But the point in which like US vacates all those bases, it also means that China and Russia have the opportunity to garner soft power, to garner more influence and more intimidation in the world, which this is bad for a few reasons, right? One is because of their general lack of disregard for human rights. Secondly, we tell you is because compared to the US, I think all of us have proved the worst actors. Thirdly, it's useless to compete with China and Russia on the front of modern militarization. I think, as we've proved to you, it's fair to assume that China and Russia have like a larger head start, and which means they have much modernized military. Understanding this, firstly, China and Russia have so much more of a head start. But secondly, the pure manufacturing power of countries like China means that US is unable to compete with them, right? But what is the exclusive power that US has? And we told you this was the exclusive thing coming from CEO. We tell you they have soft power. How is this soft power garnered? It's because of the physical presence they had in the world. The fact that they had a like a sense of intimidation by being all around the world, by having bases all around the world. This tells you this is a way that US garners soft power. This is a way that US influences and shapes what happens in the world. Why is this soft power important? It's because this power is exclusive to the US, and this allows them this allows the US to use as a bargaining chip, increasing negotiations. Tell you this is exclusive to US, but the point in which US gives this up by losing physical presence in the world. Tell you that is when China and Russia can utilize it for their own gain. What did CEO bring to you? US is exclusive power or soft power, and why that's so important, and why you lose it the point at which you start to modernize your military and balance, because of the fact that they bring mutually assured destruction to the table to China and Russia. And thirdly, we told you it's useless to compete with China and Russia on the front of modernized military, because of the fact they will lose out. There's China and Russia have a head start, and the best way that we can check and balance Russia and China is through utilizing the soft power that the US military always had. For all those reasons, now been prouder to oppose.
Thank you guys. I'll just mute this call, make my decision, then I'll be right back.